Welcome everyone. I hope I'm audible. Good morning to all of you. Good morning. Right. So in our last class, we were talking about the Swadeshi movement. We had seen the circumstances behind it, that is the partition of Bengal. We had also prepared the background for the Swadeshi movement by discussing the rise of extremism in national politics. We had discussed how the partition of Bengal triggered a change in the leadership of the national movement, and it slipped out of the grasp of the moderates and came within the grasp of the extremist faction. They opposed the partition of Bengal through the use of radical methods, including boycott, the promotion of national education, the promotion of Swadeshi, and the organization of volunteer corps or samitis. Right? And now we enter the last stretch of our discussion, namely the spread and extent of the movement, the reasons for its failure, and its significance in the history of modern India. So beginning with the spread and extent of the movement. Now, just one association between the spread and extent and the reasons for failure was the different approach adopted by the moderates and the extremists during the Swadeshi movement. The moderates felt that since the Swadeshi movement's main agenda was to annul the partition of Bengal, therefore, the movement should remain within Bengal and not spread beyond it. On the other hand, for the extremists, the partition of Bengal was simply a symptom, simply an outcome of British misrule in India. They felt that the British were trying to undermine Indian nationalism by playing the politics of divide and rule. And thus, they did not simply want the annulment of partition of Bengal, they wanted Swaraj. And since Swaraj was not particularly a Bengali demand, rather it was an Indian demand, they felt that the movement should not remain confined within Bengal. It should emerge as an all India movement. Now, initially, the moderates had to accept the extremist position, and the movement actually spread beyond the borders of Bengal as well. It was quite active in places such as Punjab, Delhi, and Pune. However, this also became a sticking point between the two sides, and it contributed eventually to the failure of the movement by causing the Surat Split. So the Surat Split was the outcome of the ideological conflict between the moderates and the extremists, and one of the points of contention between them was the territorial limits of the movement. Moderates wanted it to remain confined within Bengal, extremists wanted an all India movement. Okay? Now coming back to the spread and extent of the movement, you can write the movement was most active in Bengal, सब पॉइंट्स लिखो. Here it attracted followers from several classes, including professionals, workers, traders and businessmen, students, and women. Full stop. Next point. Next main point. In 1906, comma, under extremist leadership, the movement spread beyond Bengal as well. Write down. Next point. Bal Gangadhar Tilak popularized it in Maharashtra, with Pune and Bombay emerging as important centers. Important centers of the movement. Okay? Next, Lala Lajpat Rai and Ajit Singh he was the uncle of Bhagat Singh. Okay? And Ajit Singh popularized the movement in Punjab. With Lahore in Punjab, emerging as an important center. Next point. At Delhi, the Swadeshi movement was led by Sayyid Haider Raza. Next sub point. V.O. Chidambaram Pillai led the movement at Madras. Led the movement at Madras. Full stop. Next main point. Across India, comma, the Swadeshi movement attracted support from students, workers, women, professionals, and petty traders. Full stop. Next sub point. Mass rallies, public demonstrations, and organized burning of foreign cloth met resounding practical success. In cities. Okay? So these were the prominent types of mass activity that was quite successful in the cities. Next sub point likho. However, the response of rural India to the call of Swadeshi, was lackluster. Full stop. This was due to the following factors. Why did the movement not resonate with the people of Indian villages? Right? तो क्या लगता है क्यों इतना पॉपुलर नहीं रहा होगा? First of all, जो leaders हैं, extremists हैं, right? Now the extremist leaders were non-elite but still urban. They were concentrated in the urban centers of India and thought in terms of urban India only. They had very little practical outreach towards the masses. Yes, some volunteer organizations were set up, बट जो प्रिपरेटरी वर्क नेसेसरी होता है कोई भी मास मूवमेंट लॉन्च करने के लिए, स्पेशली इन विलेजेस, दैट हैड नॉट बीन डन येट, राइट? सो द एक्सट्रीमिस्ट्स वर जस्ट बिगिनिंग द प्रोसेस ऑफ एस्टैब्लिशिंग अ ग्रास रूट्स नेटवर्क इन द इंडियन विलेजेस. वो काम अभी तक पूरा नहीं हुआ था, इनफैक्ट अभी केवल शुरुआत हुई थी उसकी. दैट वाज वन रीजन व्हाई रूरल इंडिया डिड नॉट विटनेस मच एक्टिविटी ड्यूरिंग द स्वदेशी मूवमेंट. सो राइट डाउन सब पॉइंट्स में. Sub point. तो ये लिखा है ना आपने, रूरल इंडिया के रिस्पॉन्स लैकलस्टर रहा, दिस वाज ड्यू टू द फॉलोइंग रीजंस, ड्यू टू द फॉलोइंग फैक्टर्स. नाउ नेक्स्ट लिखो सब पॉइंट, नंबर 1 2 3 4 करके लिख लेना. नंबर 1, the extremists had not been able to link the political urges of rural India to the cities. Full stop. Same में continue करो. While volunteer organizations had started becoming active in the Indian villages, their activities were still at the initial stages. Full stop. In other words, the preparatory work needed to mobilize the rural masses was yet to be done. ठीक है, एक रीजन तो ये था. दूसरा रीजन, there was also an inherent class divide between the leadership and the peasant masses of rural India. The majority of the Congress leaders, चाहे वो moderates हो चाहे extremists हो, they also had either personal holdings in rural India or they knew someone. Their support base came from the zamindar section of rural India. ठीक है, तो there was a clash of interests over here, because if they were to represent the interests of the actual peasants living in rural India, then they would either have to sacrifice their own interest or the interests of their biggest supporters, that is the zamindars. So because of this clash of interests, their willingness to actually sacrifice their interests also comes into the limelight. तो वो इतने अच्छे से उनको मोबिलाइज करने की कोशिश नहीं करी गई, and that is why the movement remained confined largely to the cities rather than spreading to the villages. ठीक है, तो next लिखो. Number 2, the movement also suffered due to a certain clash of interests between the aspirations of the rural peasants and the personal interests of the Congress leadership. Full stop. Congress leadership. Full stop. सेम पॉइंट में कंटिन्यू करो. most of the Congress leaders either owned land in the villages, or depended upon the support of the wealthy zamindars of Bengal. Full stop. Next sub point. Oh, sorry, same में continue करो. Therefore, mobilizing the peasants for a political cause seemed like a dangerous proposition. Dangerous proposition. Full stop. As a result, comma, the Congress leadership was not very enthusiastic about mobilizing the peasants. ठीक है. थर्ड रीजन लिखो. देखो इसमें एक और मेजर फैक्टर था दैट जो class divide tha between the peasants and the zamindars that also overlapped with the communal divide between the peasants and zamindars, especially in Bengal. In Bengal, the majority of the zamindars were Hindus, whereas the bulk of the peasants were Muslim. ठीक है. And we have already seen a weakness with the extremist mobilization machinery. तो उसमें जो tools use किए जा रहे थे, they were cultural nationalism. What were the extremist leaders appealing to? To the Hindu identity of Indians. Would this appeal actually attract Muslim peasants? No, they were not likely to respond. Rather, they saw the movement with suspicion because ये जो class था, this was already oppressing them, and the movement was seen as an ally of this class, which also shared the religious divide between Hindus and Muslims. ठीक है? So next sub point लिखो number 3. Further, in Bengal, comma, the class divide also overlapped with the communal divide. Full stop. The bulk of zamindars were Hindus, while peasants were Muslims. Full stop. कंटिन्यू करो. This was further compounded. This was further compounded by the inability of the movement to attract Muslims. To attract Muslims. Due to its repeated appeal to Hindu religion and culture. To Hindu religion and culture. ठीक है? So it was due to these factors that not only did peasants not participate in the movement in any meaningful way, and also why Muslims largely stayed away from the movement. ठीक है? Next main point लिखो. हाँ, next main point. हाँ, main point. जैसे ये वाला लिखा था ना, बाद next main point. The movement also failed to draw substantial support from Indian Muslims. Failed to draw substantial support from Indian Muslims. रीजन आपको ऑलरेडी पता है. क्यों? नॉट ओनली बिकॉज पेजेंट्स और जमींदार के बीच में क्लास डिवाइड जो था वो रिलीजियस डिवाइड से ओवरलैप करता था, वो तो एक रीजन था, बट बिकॉज ऑफ द स्ट्रैटेजी अडॉप्टेड बाय द extremist leaders. They wanted to mobilize the masses in large numbers, therefore they appealed to their religious identity, but they forgot to include the religious identity of the Indian Muslims. So their appeals remained exclusionary in nature. It was not very inclusive. Write down, sub point likho. This was largely due to the use of Hindu cultural symbols by the extremists to attract the masses. Full stop. Muslim masses were automatically excluded. Muslim masses were automatically excluded. ठीक है? The second reason was that there were some elements within the Muslim political class, Muslim elite class, who felt quite satisfied with the partition of Bengal along religious lines. हम बात कर रहे हैं मुस्लिम लीग फैक्शन की, जैसे नवाब सलीमुल्लाह हो गए ढाका के, या फिर मोहसिन उल मुल्क, वकार उल मुल्क, द आगा खान ऑफ दैट पीरियड, राइट? सो ये सब लोग एक्चुअली दे वांटेड द पार्टीशन ऑफ बंगाल इनटू टू ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ रिलीजन. They were happy with the creation of a new Muslim majority province consisting of a vast majority of the area of Bengal. Okay? And thus they began appealing to the Muslim masses not to participate in the movement. Rather, they wanted to remain loyal to the British. Okay? Next, likho, next point. Secondly, a class of the a section of the Muslim political elite a section of the Muslim political elite also opposed the Swadeshi movement on political grounds. On political grounds. Full stop. Leaders such as Nawab Salimullah of Dhaka, Aga Khan, Mohsin-ul Mulk, and Waqar-ul Mulk were satisfied with the creation of a new Muslim majority province in Bengal. Full stop. They felt that this was in the long-term interests of the Bengali Muslim community. Full stop. In June 1906, they led a deputation to Shimla to meet the Governor General. कौन था गवर्नर जनरल इस समय? मिंटो. To meet the Governor General, Lord Minto, pledge loyalty to the British rule, and demanded further concessions for Indian Muslims. ठीक है? And in December 1906, the December of the very same year, these people actually laid the foundations of the All India Muslim League. Same में लिखो. Later, in December 1906, they founded the Muslim League They founded the Muslim League with the agenda, with the agenda to represent the interests of Indian Muslims, of Indian Muslims. Full stop. From the very beginning, from the very beginning, they had a pro-British, anti-Congress stance. Pro-British, anti-Congress stance. And did their best, and did their best to undermine the Swadeshi movement in the eyes of ordinary Muslims. In the eyes of ordinary Muslims. ठीक है? So these are the two significant reasons why the Swadeshi movement failed to draw substantial support from the Indian Muslims. एक तो movement का खुद का flaw that it used Hindu cultural symbols exclusively to draw out the masses, so Muslim masses were automatically excluded. And second was the attitude of the Muslim political elite who ended up founding the Muslim League in the backdrop of the movement and actively appealed to the masses to stay away from this Congress-led movement. They painted the Congress as an anti-Muslim organization, as a caste Hindu party, and they adopted a loyalist and anti-Congress stance. So स्वदेशी मूवमेंट को अंडरमाइन करने के लिए दे स्टार्टेड एक्टिवली वर्किंग अमंग द मासेस. ठीक है, नेक्स्ट लिखो मेन पॉइंट. द स्वदेशी मूवमेंट greatly benefited from the active support of intellectuals and artists. Intellectuals and artists. कैसे? किसी भी मूवमेंट को सपोर्ट करने के लिए एक आइडियोलॉजी होनी चाहिए उसके पीछे, राइट? एंड दैट आइडियोलॉजी वाज बीइंग प्रोवाइडेड बाय these individuals, intellectuals and artists. हम किन पर्सनालिटीज की बात कर रहे हैं? People such as Rabindranath Tagore. Write down. Rabindranath Tagore, subpoint, Rabindranath Tagore emerged as the intellectual grandfather of the Swadeshi movement. Intellectual grandfather of the Swadeshi movement. Full stop. He popularized the idea of Atma Shakti. He popularized the idea of Atma Shakti. as the means to assert independence. Full stop. It stood for inner strength, self-sufficiency, and self-help. Inner strength, self-sufficiency, and self-help. Full stop. This became the motto behind Swadeshi and Swaraj. This became the motto behind Swadeshi and Swaraj. Full stop. The former represented self-sufficiency, while the latter stood for self-rule. ठीक है. Next sub point. Further, Rabindranath Tagore actively contributed to the building of a strong cultural identity, not only for the movement but for Bengalis and Indians as a whole. Full stop. Same point में continue करो. He wrote his famous song Amar Sonar Bangla, which emerged as the unofficial anthem of the people of Bengal, and stood for the solidarity between the two halves of Bengal. Full stop. Next sub point. Other artists such as Abanindranath Tagore, led the charge for creating patriotic art, for creating patriotic art. Full stop. He visualized India as a holy goddess, as a holy goddess in the form of भारत माता. ठीक है, तो उन्हें इंडिया को ही डेइफाई कर दिया, भगवान का दर्जा दे दिया, माँ का दर्जा दे दिया. राइट, तो इस तरह के एक्टिविटीज. राइट डाउन. such symbols such symbols such symbols resonated powerfully with the masses, transforming their struggle into a holy crusade, against a foreign oppressor, ठीक है. तो मूवमेंट के जो मुहिम की मायने थे, द पैरामीटर्स ऑफ द मूवमेंट अर्लियर दे वर सिंपली पॉलिटिकल और इकोनॉमिक. अब उसमें तब्दीली आएगी. देयर इज गोइंग टू बी अ ट्रांसफॉर्मेशन. पहले वो केवल एक पॉलिटिकल मूवमेंट थी. नाउ दैट इज गोइंग टू बी ट्रांसफॉर्म्ड इनटू अ होली, राइचियस, just and religious struggle against a deserving enemy, against a deserving target, a foreign oppressor who was virtually enslaving the holy mother goddess of the land. ठीक है, so that is what resulted that is the reason why the Swadeshi movement was able to draw such a fervent and enthusiastic support from such a large cross section. ठीक है, नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट लिखो. स्टूडेंट्स also participated in the movement in large numbers. Students also participated in the movement in large numbers. Now their participation was not very easy. In fact, they had to risk a lot. वो कभी भी पुलिस का डंडा खा सकते थे, माँ बाप से मार खा सकते थे, स्कूल से एक्सपेल्शन मिल सकता था, या फिर other disciplinary actions could have been taken against them. In fact, to suppress the participation of students in any political activity, the government of Bengal had come out with a circular which proposed certain guidelines for model student behavior. इसको बोलते थे कार्लाइल सर्कुलर. कार्लाइल वाज द लेफ्टिनेंट गवर्नर ऑफ बंगाल. उसके ही अथॉरिटी के अंदर ये सर्कुलर इंट्रोड्यूस किया गया था. इट कंप्लीटली prohibited the participation of either school students or university students in any public demonstrations or meetings. If somebody was caught participating in a meeting, this circular empowered the authorities to begin criminal proceedings against them as well as their legal guardians. So it put the onus of guaranteeing good behavior on the students and their guardians. Further, the circular also threatened any prospective participants in the Swadeshi movement with automatic expulsions and automatic disqualification from any kind of public employment. उस जमाने में पब्लिक सेक्टर ही एक ऑर्गेनाइज सेक्टर था इंडिया में, प्राइवेट सेक्टर वाज नॉट ऑर्गेनाइज्ड एट ऑल, एंड जो थोड़ी बहुत एक्टिविटी थी भी, that was not large enough to absorb the large masses of students that schools and colleges were churning out every year. So this virtually ended any career prospects for even the most deserving students, right? And the Carlisle circular was meant to have what is known as a chilling effect on student activity. ठीक है, तो चिलिंग इफेक्ट का मतलब क्या होता है कि इट इज सॉर्ट ऑफ प्रिवेंटेटिव स्ट्रैटेजी, एक या दो स्टूडेंट्स का एग्जाम्पल बना दो एंड ट्रीट देम एक्सट्रीमली हार्शली, तो जैसे कि बुलडोजर वगैरह चलवा दो, एंड तो बाकी सब अपने आप लाइन पे आ जाएंगे, राइट? सो द मूवमेंट इंस्टेड ऑफ रीचिंग द बॉइलिंग पॉइंट विल बी फ्रोजन इनटू प्लेस. Now, the students had to risk all of this to participate, but they still continued to do so in large numbers. And one of the reasons for the success of the Swadeshi movement in bringing out the students was its program of national education. So, if students are rusticated, they would have a Swadeshi school. Where they would receive literary, technical, as well as moral education along nationalist lines. The technological gap between Indians and the British would be overcome with foreign help. So, a large number of professors and students were sent to Japan in order to learn their best practices. And further, any students targeted by the government for participating in the Swadeshi movement would be legally sheltered by its leaders, by this entire machinery. Legal protection was also offered. And this had the effect of virtually liberating the students of any kind of fear of government repression. Okay? It also convinced their legal guardians, their parents in most cases, of the benefits of national education over government education. ठीक है? So अभी आपने क्या लिखा है? Students participated in large numbers during the Swadeshi movement. Full stop. This was despite the Carlisle Circular, which was designed to have a chilling effect, on student participation. Full stop. Student participation. Full stop. Sub point likho. The main reason behind this was the program of national education. Launched by the leaders. Which provided a Swadeshi alternative to government schools and colleges. Swadeshi alternative to government schools and colleges. Comma. Promised the inculcation of patriotic values within the framework of comprehensive education, comma, sought to overcome technical deficits by adopting the best practices and technology of foreign allies such as Japan, and offered legal protection from government repression. ठीक है? समझ में आया? So, as a result, students continued to participate in large numbers. Next point. One highlight of the movement, one highlight of the movement was the entry of women into nationalist politics. Into nationalist politics. Full stop. Subpoint. This was made possible. This was made possible due to the appeals and propaganda of the extremist leaders. Same point mein, they had successfully transformed the political struggle against British rule into a moral and religious struggle. Into a moral and religious struggle. ठीक है? While women in India were excluded from the political stage traditionally, they were expected to lead their communities and families in its moral and religious journey, right? And therefore, the movement had normalized the participation of women in the eyes of traditionalist Indians also. तो जब women large numbers में सड़कों पर आई to lead this moral and religious struggle, किसी ने उनको उनके घर से अपोज नहीं किया, रोकने की कोशिश नहीं करी, because they felt that इनका यही रोल है, they are simply trying to fulfill their role. Write down this. Same point. This normalized the participation of women in nationalist politics, since it was considered to be part of the traditional role of women. ये आर्गुमेंट समझ में आया है? पक्का? राइट. नेक्स्ट सब पॉइंट. फर्दर अगला सब पॉइंट. फर्दर the movement was also able to provide practical means for the participation of women. ठीक है? कि मूवमेंट में आपको अपना रोल अदा करना है तो कोई जरूरी नहीं है कि अपना गांव छोड़ करके या फिर अपना घर छोड़ करके आप कलकत्ता के सिटी सेंटर में जाएं, वहां पे मासेस के साथ नारेबाजी करें. ये सब करने की जरूरत नहीं है आपको. You can simply visit your local मेला, वहां पे जो लीडर हैं उनकी जो सभा चल रही है उसमें आप बैठिए, उनकी बातें सुनिए. It is not necessary for you to travel to a British or to an Indian port to boycott a ship carrying foreign goods. You can simply go to your own mohalla square and over there publicly burn British cloth. You can prohibit your family from consuming foreign goods. कि नमक खाना है तो वो भी देश का होना चाहिए, आटा लेना है तो वो भी देश का होना चाहिए, कपड़ा पहनना है तो वो भी स्वदेशी होना चाहिए. In fact, you can positively contribute to the Swadeshi movement. How? By spinning yarn in your own home, which you have been traditionally doing since you were a small child, right? तो जो आप काम कर रहे थे वही आप करते रहो, and that would now be seen as a form of nationalist service. So because the movement was able to provide practical means for the women to exhibit their patriotism, to exert their energies, that is why it succeeded in bringing out women in large numbers. ठीक है, तो अभी आपने क्या लिखा है? Movement was able to provide practical means for the participation of women, including the Khadi program, comma, peaceful picketing of shops selling foreign goods, comma, boycott of liquor, and public burning of foreign cloth. ठीक है? So while the movement was successful in bringing out women, students, professionals, intellectuals, artists, and petty traders, it failed to draw the support of either Indian Muslims in large numbers or peasants in large numbers. ठीक है, तो peasants और Muslims को large numbers में नहीं draw कर पाए, इसके अलावा बाकी सारे classes को draw किया. Now take down a question. Throw light on the level of mass participation during the Swadeshi movement. Full stop. How did it attract women and students? Question mark. Why was it unable to draw out Muslims and peasants? Question mark. Word limit is 200. तो 3 पार्ट्स में आपको इसे आंसर करना होगा. first throwing light on the level of mass participation during the Swadeshi movement. The movement was most active in Bengal, since Bengal was the traditional heartland of Indian nationalism, and it was Bengal that was directly affected by its partition. But it also spread to beyond Bengal due to the conscious efforts of the extremist leaders, with Punjab, Maharashtra, and Madras emerging as important centers of the movement. While the movement was working towards attracting the rural masses, it remained largely an urban affair. Okay? Drawing support from several urban classes. Okay? On the whole, we could say that the initiation of the stage of mass politics in India witnessed the emergence of an all India mass movement with a particular limitation, that it remained largely an urban affair, right? Without rural support. And what had Mahatma Gandhi had to say about India? कहाँ पे रहता है? India lives in the villages. So while it was an all India mass movement, it was not actually a mass movement, an all India movement in the true sense. ठीक है? Not in the true sense. Clear? अब बताइए आपको इन दोनों में से कौन से वाले को पहले एड्रेस करना चाहिए? Why it was able to attract women and students, or why it was unable to attract Muslim and peasants? You have ended over here. पहला सेक्शन आपने यहाँ पे इस नोट पे एंड किया है. पहले विमेन एंड स्टूडेंट्स को एड्रेस करना चाहिए या मुस्लिम एंड पेजेंट्स को? पहले मुस्लिम्स एंड पेजेंट्स को, बिकॉज यू शुड कीप इन माइंड कि किस नोट पे आप ट्रांजिशन कर रहे हो टुवर्ड्स द नेक्स्ट स्टेज. Next, you are going to address its inability to attract Muslims and peasants. ठीक है? इससे एक एडवांटेज भी होगा, that you will be able to conclude your answer on a positive note by ending by talking about its ability to bring out women and students onto the political stage in large numbers for the first time. ठीक है? अब जो इसके particulars हैं, I'm sure you will be able to recall them. छोटा छोटा ही आपको लिखना है, 50-55 वर्ड्स में दोनों सेक्शंस को आपको एड्रेस करना होगा. देन कंक्लूजन, उसमें क्या बात करोगे आप? अबाउट द ओवरऑल सिग्निफिकेंस ऑफ द स्वदेशी मूवमेंट टू मास पॉलिटिक्स इन इंडिया. क्या नोटेबल है यहां पर? दैट इट वाज द फर्स्ट मास मूवमेंट in the national struggle. Right? And through the process of experimentation, trial and error, Indian nationalists learned some valuable lessons. You can simply write, it imparted some valuable lessons to the Indian nationalists, who went on to create a more perfect model of mass politics. So, mass politics evolved as a result to eventually emerge as the greatest strength of the national movement leading up to independence. ठीक है? So on that note, we should conclude our answer. Clear है? Online students, I hope this is clear. Abhiram, Pratik. Okay. ये तो हो गया spread and extent of the Swadeshi movement. Next, we have to discuss the reasons for the failure of the Swadeshi movement. बताइए जी, what were the factors contributing to the failure of the Swadeshi movement? एक तो कुछ limitations थे उसके mass strategy में. It was not designed to attract all Indians. Rather, it was designed in a manner to exclude a particular group. Right? We are talking, of course, about the Muslims and the peasants. So write down number one. The movement was unsuccessful in attracting the peasants and Muslims. Unsuccessful in attracting the peasants and Muslims. Full stop. As a result, comma, it lacked the necessary strength and cohesion. ठीक है? So when you are facing a very strong opponent, तो आपको अपने आप को हर साइड से डिफेंड करना होता है. But the movement had left a gaping hole in the defense, because of which the British were able to exploit the internal differences between Indians. For example, जमींदार्स और peasants को एक दूसरे के अगेंस्ट खड़ा करने में कामयाब हो गए, हिंदूज एंड मुस्लिम्स को एक दूसरे के खिलाफ खड़ा करने में कामयाब हो गए, राइट? And because of which the movement lacked both strength as well as cohesion. कोऑर्डिनेशन नहीं था अमंग डिफरेंट सेक्शंस ऑफ इंडियंस कि क्या स्ट्रैटेजी फॉलो करनी चाहिए, क्या ऑब्जेक्टिव्स होने चाहिए, एंड रिजल्ट क्या कैसा दिखेगा, इस पे कोई सहमति नहीं बन रही थी. राइट. सो दिस वाज वन फैक्टर. सेकंड लिखो, द मेथड्स adopted during the Swadeshi movement, were they tried and tested? पहले से established थे? नहीं. Were new and unfamiliar. Were new and unfamiliar. ठीक है. Now, for example, when it came to boycotting of foreign goods, कॉन्सेप्ट तो बड़ा सिंपल लगता है कि अंग्रेजी मेड कपड़ा, अंग्रेजी मेड सामान, किताबें, फर्नीचर, कुछ भी हम नहीं कंज्यूम करेंगे. बट प्रैक्टिकली इसको इम्प्लीमेंट करना थोड़ा मुश्किल होता है, बिकॉज by the time that the Swadeshi movement came around 1905 तक, the British had entrenched themselves very deeply into the Indian economy, right? Large sectors of the Indian economy were completely dependent upon British imports. To suddenly withdraw their cooperation from their own economic structure, that would have harmed the interests of ordinary Indians also. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, अगर इंडियंस लार्ज स्केल में सेक्युलरली होल सोल ब्रिटिश मैन्युफैक्चर्ड क्लॉथ को बॉयकॉट एक्चुअली कर देते, देन देयर वुड हैव बीन अ मेजर शॉर्टेज ऑफ क्लॉथ, बिकॉज कोई इंडियन इंडस्ट्री तो थी नहीं, राइट, उसको रिप्लेस करने के लिए. एंड जो स्वदेशी ऑल्टरनेटिव्स थे, एक तो बनाने में महंगे होंगे क्योंकि वो हैंडमेड होंगे, ऑर्गेनाइज्ड एक्टिविटी से नहीं होगा. And secondly, the volume that could be generated, that would have been much lower than the actual demand. So even boycott of foreign goods came with practical limitations. Secondly, when it came to boycotting British institutions, it was even more complicated. We are talking about institutions such as schools and colleges, legislatures and governing councils, or even British law courts. ये ठीक है, मुहिम चल गई कि इनको बॉयकॉट करना है, लोगों ने कर भी दिया. कोई डिस्प्यूट होगा तो कौन से कोर्ट में जाओगे? Is there a viable Swadeshi alternative? Even if an arbitrary court is set up by the nationalist leaders, who is going to enforce its recommendations, its awards, right? क्योंकि enforce करने के लिए तो पुलिस सपोर्ट चाहिए, तो वो किसकी है? अंग्रेजों की है. The police will never recognize the authority of Indian arbitration courts to settle disputes. वो क्या बोलेंगे कि अगर रेजोल्यूशन चाहिए तो लॉ कोर्ट में वापस जाना पड़ेगा डिस्प्यूट को लेकर के. स्कूल्स एंड कॉलेजेस को बॉयकॉट कर दिया, चलो बहुत अच्छी बात है, बट इज द नेशनलिस्ट लीडरशिप ऑर्गेनाइज्ड इनफ to actually provide viable social Swadeshi alternative? Will they be able to accommodate all the students, right? Will they find a large number of teachers? Will they have the infrastructure, right? तो ये सारे कुछ प्रैक्टिकल लिमिटेशन से मर्ज होंगे. Thirdly, legislatures and councils को अगर boycott कर दिया, so once again problem वही होगा कि who is going to organize the legislative work, who is going to organize the developmental work, who is going to provide governance. So that would require the active cooperation of the government, जो कि जिससे आपका पंगा चल रहा है, right? So boycotting of British institutions was even more complicated. Thirdly, कुछ ऐसे आइडियाज थे फॉर एग्जाम्पल पैसिव रेजिस्टेंस, इनको प्रैक्टिस में लाना थोड़ा मुश्किल होता है, राइट? सो इसका प्रैक्टिकल एक्सप्रेशन कैसा होना चाहिए, उसके ऊपर क्वेश्चन मार्क्स थे. फॉर एग्जाम्पल ऑरबिंदो घोष सजेस्टेड दैट वन ऑफ द मेथड्स ऑफ पैसिव रेजिस्टेंस शुड बी civil disobedience of unjust laws, right? Now पहला डिस्प्यूट इमर्ज होगा कि कौन से लॉ का विरोध करना चाहिए, किस लॉ को तोड़ना चाहिए, एंड इसका अल्टीमेट ऑब्जेक्टिव क्या होगा. दैट वाज वेरी डिफिकल्ट टू एक्सप्लेन टू द पीपल हु वर बीइंग आस्क्ड टू मेक वेरी हेवी सैक्रिफाइसेस फॉर अ गोल दैट दे कुड नॉट क्लियरली सी. फॉर एग्जाम्पल अगर मान लो कि अनलॉफुल असेंबली के ऊपर रोक लगा दी गई है, सेक्शन 144 प्रीवियस जो सीआरपीसी का था, दैट इज इन प्लेस. 5 लोग से ज्यादा की असेंबली है, इफ इट इज नॉट परमिटेड देन इट वुड बी हेल्ड एज लॉफुल और सबको जेल हो जाएगी. चलो ठीक है, 5 लोगों को आपने कन्विंस कर लिया कि जहां वहां पे जाओ बाजार के बीच में और वंदे मातरम के नारे लगाओ, राइट? बट व्हाट इज गोइंग टू बी द एंड ऑब्जेक्टिव? तो अरबिंदो ने बोला कि वी आर गोइंग टू स्टार्ट अ जेल भरो आंदोलन, प्रिजन्स को भरने का. राइट? एंड जेल भरो आंदोलन में जो बंदा एक्चुअली जेल में है वो तो सफर कर रहा है. एंड ऑब्जेक्टिव ओनली दी लीडर इज एबल टू सी. व्हाट इज द एंड ऑब्जेक्टिव? टू प्रेशराइज द ब्रिटिश कि अगर 5 लाख लोग अंग्रेजों की जेल में होंगे तो कम से कम 50,000 पुलिस वाले जेल के अंदर रहने पड़ेंगे उनको देखने के लिए, वहां पे सिक्योरिटी प्रोवाइड करने के लिए, लॉ एंड ऑर्डर मेंटेन करने के लिए, कि जेल के अंदर ही लॉ ब्रेकिंग ना होने लग जाए. The British resources will have to be mobilized in order to house these people, in order to feed them, right? तो एंड में एक्चुअल प्रिजनर कौन है? इज इट द इंडियंस और इज इट द ब्रिटिश? ब्रिटिश है तो टू इम्प्रिजन देम विद इन देयर ओन जेल्स, ये एजेंडा है. बट दिस इज नॉट क्लियरली विजिबल टू द पीपल हु आर बीइंग आस्क्ड टू फिल द जेल्स. एक्चुअली उनको क्या लगेगा, यार हम तो जेल के अंदर आ गए, पुलिस ने हमको 2 साल के लिए नजरबंद कर दिया, लेकिन एंड रिजल्ट कुछ मिल नहीं रहा है. तो इट वाज नॉट पॉसिबल फॉर द लीडरशिप टू प्रैक्टिकली एक्सप्रेस देयर मूवमेंट, टू कन्विंस द पीपल. ऑल्टरनेटिवली एक और एग्जांपल ले लो कि why passive resistance was difficult to express in a practical form. For example, one of the most important acts of passive resistance was the burning of foreign cloth. ठीक है, मॉरल स्टांस क्या होना चाहिए कि आप किसी और से उसका कपड़ा छीन के उसको जला दो, कि अगर किसी आदमी ने कोई फॉरेन की कमीज पहनी हुई है तो आप उसको फाड़ के उसका बॉनफायर कर दो. ये नहीं होना चाहिए. मॉरल तो चॉइस ये होना चाहिए कि आप खुद से जाओ, कपड़ा ऑब्टेन करो, खरीदो, घर में रखा है तो वो लेकर के आओ, उसको पब्लिकली बर्न करो. ठीक है, बट ये करने से एक्चुअल में फर्स्ट person who suffers, who is that going to be? Is it going to be the British industrialists overseas or the British banks funding them? No, it is going to be the petty traders or individuals who are being asked to make this sacrifice. Secondly, it was very difficult to distinguish between the moral and immoral choice. तो कुछ लोग जो समझते थे डिफरेंस, उन्होंने तो यही स्ट्रैटेजी अपनाया कि अपना खुद का कपड़ा लाएंगे या फिर खरीद करके लाएंगे और उसको पब्लिकली बर्न करेंगे ना, सिंबॉलिक फैशन. ठीक है, बट कुछ लोगों ने क्या किया They started looting, लूटपाट मचाने लग गए. They started attacking goods shops selling foreign goods, and they started burning those goods publicly. But that was leading to law breaking of a nature जो कि leadership accept नहीं करने के लिए तैयार थी, because they wanted Indians to retain the moral high ground. But it is very difficult to manage the passions of the masses. जब masses में वो energy भर जाती है, so it can act in a very unpredictable manner. So that is why पैसिव रेजिस्टेंस को प्रैक्टिकली एक्सप्रेस करना काफी डिफिकल्ट था. ठीक है, तो व्हाट हैव यू रिटन? मेथड्स यूज्ड वर न्यू एंड अनफैमिलियर. फुल स्टॉप. सब पॉइंट लिखो. नीदर द लीडर्स nor the masses had any prior experience of organizing a mass struggle and strategies such as passive resistance, non-cooperation, and boycott were being experimented with for the first time. Full stop. Next point. It was difficult to put some of these ideas into practice. ठीक है. नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट लिखो. Now, all mass struggles have certain inherent limitations. And the Swadeshi movement was also not immune to these. Write down. All forms of mass struggle have certain inherent limitations which also affected the Swadeshi movement. Now, for a mass struggle to actually succeed, एक perfect recipe होनी चाहिए. ठीक है. First of all, the leadership has to have a clear agenda. तो leadership में कोई internal divisions नहीं होने चाहिए. Cohesive leadership is necessary. Secondly, there should be sufficient energy in the masses जो कि leadership ऑर्गेनाइज करेगा, ओरिएंट करेगा, डायरेक्ट करेगा, चैनलाइज करेगा, ठीक है। अगर एनर्जी नहीं होगा तो मूवमेंट इज गोइंग टू फेल, इट इज गोइंग टू फॉल डाउन। थर्डली, not only shall the leadership be cohesive, but जो mass है that should also be well organized and formed into a potent weapon against a single common enemy. There should be an absence of internal divisions between the interests of the masses. ठीक है। So these are the three chief ingredients of an ideal mass struggle जो कि sustain किया जा सकता है long period तक. However, almost all mass struggles में ये ideal बहुत rarely achieve होता है, क्योंकि leadership कहीं पे एक तरह का नहीं सोच रखती है. There is personal rivalry among the leaders. There are ideological conflict between the leaders. Objectives में, methods में leaders अपने एक दूसरे से differ करते हैं, right? Some point to the benefits of a particular method. Some point out its dangers. Some see the benefits of a particular strategy, but some see the pitfalls in the long run. कुछ लीडर्स शॉर्ट टर्म ऑब्जेक्टिव्स को आगे रखते हैं, कुछ लीडर्स लॉन्ग टर्म ऑब्जेक्टिव्स को आगे रखते हैं. तो लीडर्स में कभी भी सहमति नहीं बनती. इट इज वेरी रेयर. सेकेंडली, the masses are always required to make a great degree of personal sacrifice for a goal that is very far away, और जिसके benefits उन तक पहुंचने में काफी टाइम लगेगा. तो शॉर्ट टर्म में उनको काफी सारे सैक्रिफाइसेस करने के लिए बोले जा रहे हैं, बट द रिवॉर्ड्स आर नॉट गोइंग टू बी इमीडिएट. दे आर गोइंग टू ट्रिकल डाउन मे बी डेकेड्स लेटर. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, स्वराज अगर 1905-1906 में मिल भी जाता, would the condition of the ordinary person have transformed radically? उसमें काफी टाइम लगता है. In fact, had the British withdrawn from India, the Indian masses would have been asked to make even further sacrifices. ठीक है. एंड इन सैक्रिफाइसेस को करने के लिए तो मासेस रेडी थे, बट ग्रेजुअली उनका इंथुजियाज्म कम होता जाएगा एज रियलिटी स्टार्ट्स टू सिंक इन. Once their businesses start to suffer, once they are kicked out of school, or once they lose their job, taking away the only source of their family income, तो अपनी सेविंग्स पे वो कब तक जिंदा रहेंगे, कब तक बच्चों की स्कूल की फीस भरेंगे, कब तक माँ के इलाज का खर्चा उठाएंगे, कब तक बहन की शादी का जो फंड है उसको जुड़ाते रहेंगे, राइट? सो दैट इज गोइंग टू बी अनदर पिटफॉल ऑफ ऑलमोस्ट ऑल मास स्ट्रगल्स. प्रैक्टिकल लिमिटेशंस, जो नेचुरल फटीग होता है, दैट इज गोइंग टू स्टार्ट सेटिंग इन. एंड मासेस में कभी भी होमोजेनिटी एक्सपेक्ट करना, दैट वुड बी अ फूल्स एरेंड. एक बहुत आइडियलिस्टिक पोजीशन हो जाएगा. इंडिया में तो चलो कोई यूनिफॉर्मिटी, होमोजेनिटी का क्वेश्चन नहीं होता है, राइट? बट इवन इन अदर एरियाज, even if they belong to the same religion, even if they all look alike, even if they speak the same language, तो कम से कम क्लासेस में तो डिफरेंस रहेगा ही ना. कोई भी फ्लैट सोसाइटी तो आज तक कोई एग्जिस्ट नहीं हुआ. इवन इन द ट्राइबल सोसाइटीज देयर इज अ पर्टिकुलर हायरार्की, राइट? तो इवन दिस इज नेवर गोइंग टू बी प्रेजेंट. और इंडिया में जो ये लिमिटेशंस थे, मतलब द एब्सेंस ऑफ ऑल दीज थिंग्स, दैट वाज एट अ peak in the backdrop of the Swadeshi movement. During the Swadeshi movement, instead of finding a cohesive leadership, we find a highly divided leadership. तो कांग्रेस was leading the movement, लेकिन moderates और extremists दो अलग-अलग factions में बटे हुए थे. And they had a difference of opinions regarding the methods, approach, the goals, everything. सब में उनके differences थे. So we find division. Secondly, while the masses exhibited a great degree of energy in the initial stages, but as the movement dragged on, with the British showing no inclination towards a compromise, the enthusiasm of the masses also started to flag, also started to decline. The practical realities of life began catching up to the masses. And these are the Indian masses of the early 20th century that we are talking about. अभी भी इंडिया is not a very wealthy country, right? हाँ, national wealth absolute terms में काफी अच्छा हो रहा है, but per capita terms में Indians are still on the lower end of the spectrum when it comes to income and wealth. Back then, it was even poorer, right? The ordinary people of India could not be expected to make unceasing sacrifices without the possibility or without the vision for rewards in the near future. So, Indians were also particularly vulnerable to political and economic fatigue. And instead of there being no internal divisions among Indians, the Indian society had deep fissures dividing it. So it was a highly divided and stratified society in which different sections genuinely felt that their interests are not shared by other classes or communities. In fact, their interests are mutually exclusive and competitive in nature. तो अगर दूसरे का फायदा होगा तो ऑटोमेटिकली मेरा नुकसान ही होगा. जीरो सम गेम के इक्वेशन से एक दूसरे के इंटरेस्ट को ये अप्रिशिएट करते थे. So these inherent limitations of mass struggle were exaggerated in the backdrop of the Swadeshi. That is the point. Write down. अभी क्या लिखा है आपने? All forms of mass struggle suffer from certain inherent limitations, and the Swadeshi movement was no exception. इस तरह कुछ लिखा है. So write down सब point में. It lacked cohesive leadership due to the deep ideological differences between moderates and extremists, next sub point. The masses had limited ability to make sacrifices with no rewards in sight, and the practical realities of life began catching up as the movement dragged on for years. Next sub point. Finally, there was a significant lack of political unity among the masses, lack of political unity among the masses, as Indian society was heavily divided and stratified. ठीक है, तो ये एक और फैक्टर बना व्हाई द स्वदेशी मूवमेंट फेल्ड. नेक्स्ट लिखो नंबर 4, bitter government repression. Bitter government repression. Full stop. Write down sub point में. The British were determined to crush the movement. Full stop. They began by suspending civil liberties such as free speech, free movement and free assembly. Free speech, movement and assembly, movement, free speech, movement and assembly. Full stop. Next sub point. They criminalized the chanting of patriotic slogans and songs such as Vande Mataram. Next sub point. They used the sedition law to target the leaders. Next sub point. The masses were threatened with police brutalities such as lathi charge, mass arrests, and preventive detention Full stop. Next sub point. Students were especially targeted in order to create a chilling effect on the movement as a whole. in order to create a chilling effect on the movement as a whole, and not even women, not even women were spared from police brutalities. From police brutalities. Full stop. Next point. In such a scenario, it was very difficult. It was very difficult to sustain the mass struggle in any meaningful way. ठीक है, तो ये एक और फैक्टर था, दैट इज बिटर गवर्नमेंट रिप्रेशन. क्लियर? एंड फाइनली लिखो दी सूरत स्प्लिट. (1907). What is the Surat Split? It refers to the events which occurred at the Surat session of the Congress in 1907, namely the expulsion of the extremists by the moderates from the Congress permanently. So it refers to the split between the extremists and the moderates. Clear है इतना? Did this split take place suddenly and unexpectedly, or was it the result of deeper long-term factors? Long-term factors. ठीक है? तो split actually manifested physically in 1907, but from the very beginning, the split already existed, not practically, but ideologically and morally. So it was the final manifestation of the ideological differences between the moderates and extremists. ठीक है? Now question emerges कि अगर ideological differences हमेशा से exist करते थे, तो why did the split take place in 1907 only? Why not before this? तो आंसर क्या होगा इसका? देखो, सपोज यू हैव अ सिरेमिक वाज, ठीक है, वो एक जगह से थोड़ा वीक है, अगर उसको आपने छोड़ दिया ऐसे ही रखा हुआ है, इज इट गोइंग टू शैटर ऑन इट्स ओन? नहीं, उस पे अगर स्ट्रेस पड़ेगा तभी वो शैटर होगा, राइट? एंड वो स्ट्रेस इस सिचुएशन में क्या था? द स्वदेशी मूवमेंट. The Swadeshi movement exposed and highlighted this ideological difference between these two groups, In fact, it even aggravated these differences. The moderates and extremists differed with each other with regards to the methods as well as objectives of the Swadeshi movement. And this further stressed the relationship between these two groups. और कौन बैठा हुआ था इन डिफरेंसेस को एक्सप्लॉइट करने के लिए? The British. The British exploited these differences in order to split the Congress, weaken it permanently, and end the Swadeshi movement. Clear hai itna? Now, with regards to the Swadeshi movement, what were the differences between the moderates and extremists? तो इन तीनों फील्ड्स में मॉडरेट्स और एक्सट्रीमिस्ट एक दूसरे से डिफर करते थे. While the moderates wanted to keep the movement confined within Bengal, extremists wanted the movement to be taken beyond Bengal, out of Bengal, and made an all India movement. While the moderates wanted the use of constitutional methods only, with their only concession being the economic boycott of British goods. The extremists wanted to transform the Swadeshi movement into a full-blown passive resistance, including non-cooperation and civil disobedience. Right? With methods such as boycotting of British institutions, government services, legislatures and councils, British law courts, and the use of aggressive methods such as mass mobilization, holding public demonstrations, as well as the jail bharo andolan. So these were the methods that were being adopted and pushed forward by the extremists. Clear hai itna? Secondly, the moderates and extremists also differed in their attitude towards mass mobilization. The moderates wanted the language to be used by the extremist leadership or the nationalist leadership to be purely secular, parliamentary, and measured. Right? So, they wanted to preserve the secular credentials of the national movement. But the extremists realized the strength of religious or cultural appeals. तो मास मोबिलाइजेशन का जो मेथड था वो भी दोनों का अलग अलग था. So on the one hand, the moderates wanted to use economic boycott, which would be put forward as the secular interest of all Indians within Bengal to obtain an element of partition and some constitutional reforms. The extremists wanted an all India movement with massive mass participation to pressurize the British through passive resistance in order to bring about Swaraj. ठीक है? So, in the context of the Swadeshi movement, the moderates and extremists differed with each other along these lines. And this division was eventually exploited by British to end the Swadeshi movement and permanently damage the Congress by splitting it. The build-up to the Surat Split should be understood in the context of the Swadeshi movement itself. Now, the Swadeshi movement officially began on the 7th of August 1905 with the boycott resolution adopted at the Calcutta Town Hall meeting. Following this, in December 1905, the Congress met at Banaras under the presidency of Gopal Krishna Gokhale. Okay? Now, although the Swadeshi movement had started and the people of Bengal had responded quite positively to it, the movement was yet to make its presence felt beyond Bengal in any meaningful way. तो कुछ स्टरिंग शुरू हुई थी फॉर एग्जांपल दिल्ली में, पंजाब में अंडर द एक्सट्रीमिस्ट लीडरशिप, लेकिन अभी मूवमेंट उतना ज्यादा मोमेंटम गेन नहीं कर पाया था, राइट? एज अ रिजल्ट द मॉडरेट्स लेड बाय गोखले एंड फिरोज शाह मेहता felt quite confident that they'll be able to claw back the leadership of the moderates. के पास advantage ये था that although they lacked the popularity of extremist leaders within the Congress, they had numerical majority over the extremists. ठीक है? And thus the moderates were able to pass mild resolutions regarding the partition of Bengal. So they mildly criticized the government and appealed to it to annul this participation. They also passed mild resolutions regarding the program of boycott. There was no mention of any kind of passive resistance, no demand for Swaraj. They only wanted constitutional reforms, greater political freedoms, legal equality, these kinds of things they wanted. There was no mention of any political activity on a mass organized scale outside Bengal. ठीक है? तो बहुत माइल्ड रेजोल्यूशंस इन्होंने पास किए इन बनारस. Would the extremists be happy with this? नहीं. The extremists were highly frustrated. ठीक है? By 1906, the situation at the ground level had changed perceptibly. The Swadeshi movement was gaining momentum across India. It had become immensely powerful in Bengal, and even outside Bengal, it was gathering strength. Lala Lajpat Rai, Sayyid Haider Raza, and Chidambaram Pillai had mobilized the masses across India in favor of the Swadeshi movement. And they were the ones who were defining the objectives of the movement. तो कांग्रेस की बात अलग हो गई, जहां पे मॉडरेट्स बोल रहे थे कि हमें केवल अनलमेंट ऑफ पार्टीशन चाहिए, कि पार्टीशन जो हुआ उसको कैंसिल कर दिया जाए. These people were demanding Swaraj, and the masses were echoing this demand as well. ठीक है? And therefore, the moderates felt greater pressure within the Congress. Now, अगला सेशन 1906 दिसंबर में हुआ at Calcutta. Now, extremists wanted that the situation at the ground level should also be reflected in the composition of the Congress as well as presidency of the Congress. They wanted either Lala Lajpat Rai or Bal Gangadhar Tilak to preside over the Calcutta session. However, moderates wanted to prevent this. They proposed a compromise. They proposed the name of Dada Bhai Naroji. Okay? Now, Dada Bhai Naroji was somebody who was equally respected by both the factions. तो उनका नाम extremists को acceptable था. They were ready to make this compromise. They were happy with this. But it was after all a compromise only. तो कुछ reciprocal action होना चाहिए. The moderates now were forced to adopt 4 radical resolutions. कौन से resolutions? स्वराज, स्वदेशी, national education, and boycott. For the first time, the Congress, including both the extremists and moderates, demanded Swaraj from British rule. It was loosely defined as a self-governance like the white colonies of Ireland, Canada and Australia. Sorry, उस समय आयरलैंड को नहीं मिला था, Canada and Australia. Swadeshi became the strength of the movement. The Congress resolved to promote the use of Swadeshi in all fields, including Swadeshi goods, Swadeshi education, Swadeshi service, as well as services, as well as Swadeshi culture, Swadeshi art and ideas. Okay? For this, the Congress adopted a resolution on promoting national education. That means the Congress's political support would be to individuals and organizations setting up national schools. The Congress also accepted the proposal of some intellectuals to come up with a new strategy for national education. तो एक नया काउंसिल बनाया गया, एक नया पेडागोजी सेट किया गया, करिकुलम को डिजाइन किया गया, the method of accrediting national schools and colleges, that was also adopted. And boycott resolution, in which the Congress resolved not only to boycott British goods, तो केवल एक economic boycott नहीं, but political and social boycott also. For example, British institutions, schools, laws, courts, etc. ये सब भी अब boycott कर दिए जाएंगे. ठीक है? However, ये जो resolutions moderates ने पास किए, वो क्या खुशी खुशी पूरी रजामंदी से किए होंगे? नहीं, उनका पोजीशन तो यहाँ पे बड़ा clear है, that this is what they wanted, these are the kinds of methods that they wanted to use. But this was something that had been forced down the throat of the moderates, and they were actively looking for an escape route. तो ये moderates का natural position नहीं था. Once again, I would like to remind you कि बाहर चाहे जो भी सिचुएशन हो, कांग्रेस के अंदर मेजॉरिटी में कौन थे? मॉडरेट्स ही थे। ठीक है, नाइनटीन जीरो सेवन कुछ डेवलपमेंट्स होते हैं। फॉर एग्जाम्पल, बाय दिस पॉइंट ऑफ टाइम गोखले has already visited England and met with the Governor General Montagu, who has indicated that if the moderates were to withdraw their support from the Swadeshi movement, the government would be more than happy to fulfill their demands. क्या चीफ डिमांड था इनका? पार्टीशन का अनिलमेंट और कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल रिफॉर्म्स। सरकार ने बोला ये स्वदेशी वगैरह छोड़ो, आई विल गिव यू वॉट एवर यू वांट, बस शांति से रहो, राइट? तो दिस हैड हैपेंड इन द समर of 1906, and since then the moderate leadership including Gokhale and Firoz Shah Mehta had been in constant contact with the British officials. ठीक है, इंडिया में भी इंग्लैंड में भी, और नेगोशिएट कर रहे थे व्हाट इंडिया वुड लुक लाइक पोस्ट स्वदेशी मूवमेंट। ठीक, बाय 1907 एक क्लियर पिक्चर इमर्ज होने लग गया। सेकेंडली, once again in June 1906, the Shimla deputation had met मिंटो एंड अपनी जो पोजीशन है वो क्लैरिफाई किया था और कुछ डिमांड्स रेज किए थे, including the demand for separate electorates. This led to the creation of the Muslim League in December 1906, and the Muslim League adopted a loyalist anti-Congress attitude. So the coalition against the extremists was becoming stronger. On the ground level, however, the Swadeshi movement was still gaining momentum. So yes, a section of the masses who had been participating in the Swadeshi movement from the very beginning, they were showing the signs of fatigue, but during 1907 नई एनर्जी इमर्ज हो रही थी। फॉर एग्जाम्पल, Aurobindo had started calling for the use of even more radical means, even if political violence is necessary. तो टेररिज्म को वो ओपन सपोर्ट कर रहे थे, राइट? आर्म्ड स्ट्रगल को वो ओपन सपोर्ट कर रहे थे। He had also started redefining the idea of Swaraj itself. For example, in 1907, through a series of pamphlets and articles, he expressed that Swaraj should not mean dominion status within British rule. Rather, it should mean complete independence outside the British Empire. India shall be self-governed entirely. पहले प्रपोजल ये था कि गवर्नर जनरल अंग्रेजों का होना चाहिए, कमांडर इन चीफ अंग्रेजों का होना चाहिए। अब उन्होंने बोला कोई हमको गवर्नर जनरल नहीं चाहिए, आर्मी हम अपनी बनाएंगे तो चीफ भी हमारा ही होगा, राइट? These kinds of things had started taking place, and thus while the overall membership or participation of the movement may have been going down, जो intensity था movement का, that was increasing, right? In 1907, the extremists wanted the session to be organized at Nagpur. अब नागपुर उस समय एक प्रोविंस हुआ करता था, सेंट्रल प्रोविंसेस एंड बेरार, सीपी बोलते हैं उसको, जो आज मध्य प्रदेश बना दिया गया है, with some areas being given to other states such as कर्नाटका, आंध्र प्रदेश etc. तो नागपुर सीपी में हुआ करता था, राइट? The extremists had raised this demand in 1906 itself. तो जब कांग्रेस का कलकत्ता सेशन खत्म हुआ, उसी समय एक्सट्रीमिस्ट ने डिमांड कर दिया था कि अगला सेशन जो होगा वो नागपुर में होना चाहिए था। Why? Because they wanted either तिलक और लाला लाजपत राय to be president. ठीक है, अब तिलक कहां के रहने वाले थे, किस प्रोविंस के? बॉम्बे। बॉम्बे प्रोविंस हुआ करता था। एंड लाला लाजपत राय, पंजाब। है ना? Now, within the Congress, there was a convention that was followed. क्या? कि प्रेसिडेंट कभी भी उस प्रोविंस का नहीं होगा जहां पे सेशन हो रहा है. तो दिस वुड हैव अलाउड both Tilak as well as Lala Lajpat Rai to be eligible for the presidency in 1907. However, the moderates by this point of time had a completely different approach and agenda. They had been given assurances by the government. They were also emboldened by the creation of the Muslim League. तो उनका जो anti-extremist alliance था, that was becoming stronger. The session was instead organized at सूरत. अभी कहां पे है? गुजरात में. उस समय गुजरात नहीं हुआ करता था. गुजरात was part of the Bombay presidency only, Bombay province only. ठीक है? तो because the next session was slated to be held at Surat, कौन automatically इससे ineligible हो गया? बाल गंगाधर तिलक. So he could not become the president. ठीक? Secondly, लाला लाजपत राय अभी भी एलिजिबल थे, बट अंग्रेजों ने उनके लिए दूसरा सोल्यूशन निकाला. They charged him with sedition and forced him into political exile. Initially, he had to leave Punjab. He went to Kashmir. Kashmir एक princely state हुआ करता था back then, right? And then even from there he was forced to take exile. तो वहां से छोड़ के उनको यूएस जाना पड़ा, सॉरी यूके जाना पड़ा, फिर वहां से वो अमेरिका चले गए. ठीक है? तो Lala Lajpat Rai was forced to go into political exile. Therefore, he was also ineligible. He was also eliminated. In this scenario, क्योंकि कांग्रेस के अंदर मॉडरेट्स की मेजॉरिटी थी और अब उनका एक नया एजेंडा था, तो दे इलेक्टेड रास बिहारी घोष, a moderate leader, as president. ठीक है? Now, इतने सब डेवलपमेंट्स के बाद, do you think that extremists and moderates would be on friendly terms? No. So there was a great degree of friction between them. And the circumstances under which the session was organized at Surat with Raj Bihari Ghosh being chosen as president, the extremists and moderates met each other in extremely charged conditions. And as soon as Raj Bihari Ghosh was elected as president, he introduced a new resolution. अब उस रेजोल्यूशन ने क्या बोला? ये जो 1906 के रेजोल्यूशंस हैं, we are going to cancel them. इसको हम अब आगे नहीं कंटिन्यू करेंगे. So he introduced the resolution to withdraw the 4 resolutions of 1907. Are the extremists going to go along? No. They almost revolted to the stage कि physical altercation even broke out. तो हाथापाई होने लग गई, जूते चप्पल कुर्सियां एक दूसरे के ऊपर चलाने लग गए लोग, right? And in this scenario, the police had to be called in. तो extremists और moderates के बीच में जो physical violence चल रहा था, they were separated first of all, and then the extremists were expelled from the sitting, from the session, forcibly, physically उनको वहां से expel कर दिया गया. The majority of extremist leaders were even arrested. And under the leadership of Raj Bihari Ghosh, with the guidance of Firoz Shah Mehta, the Congress adopted a series of resolutions expelling the extremists permanently. तो उसमें कांग्रेस का एक कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन होता था, तो इट वाज देयर सिंस द वेरी बिगिनिंग. उसमें एक आर्टिकल था, नया आर्टिकल इंट्रोड्यूस किया, मतलब अमेंड करके इंट्रोड्यूस किया गया, आर्टिकल 20. तो उसमें अब कुछ नए प्रोविजंस डाल दिए गए. it provided for the entry of new members into the Congress. तो अब कुछ safeguards डाल दिए गए. For example, एक safeguard डाला गया that it would the Congress would admit only those members who had been affiliated either with a Congress allied party or by a party recognized by the Congress for at least 3 years. तो या तो कम से कम 3 साल पुरानी होनी चाहिए और उसके ऊपर से कांग्रेस को उसको रिकग्नाइज भी करना चाहिए. तो इस तरह के सेफगार्ड्स डाल दिए गए. तो एक्सट्रीमिस्ट लीडर्स हु वर पार्ट्स ऑफ अदर पार्टीज, उनको अब कांग्रेस अपने आप से यूनिलैटरली डिस्क्वालीफाई कर सकता था फ्रॉम परमानेंट मेंबरशिप, फ्रॉम फ्यूचर मेंबरशिप इनटू द कांग्रेस. ठीक है. सो विद दिस द सूरत स्प्लिट टुक प्लेस. ठीक है. It is also important to keep in mind the government strategy. In this entire scenario, they came up with the strategy of policy of carrot and stick. So as is evident from the name, एक कैरेट को डैंगल किया जाएगा एक हाथ से और दूसरे हाथ में छड़ी होगा. तो इंडिकेशन इज क्लियर कि ये तुम्हारे सामने 2 दरवाजे हैं, एक के पीछे रिवॉर्ड है, दूसरे के पीछे पनिशमेंट है. चॉइस इज अप टू यू. अब ये किसके टुवर्ड्स ओरिएंटेड होगा? विल इट बी ओरिएंटेड टुवर्ड्स, मतलब विल द गवर्नमेंट बी ट्राइंग टू सिग्नल द मॉडरेट्स और द एक्सट्रीमिस्ट्स? एक्सट्रीमिस्ट तो उनकी बात सुनने के लिए तैयार ही नहीं है, तो एक्सट्रीमिस्ट से बात करने का फायदा नहीं है. मॉडरेट्स बात सुन रहे हैं तो उनके सामने कैरेट को डैंगल करो, उन्हीं को छड़ी भी दिखाओ. गिव देम द चॉइस. ठीक है. इट वुड हैव टू बी इंप्लीमेंटेड इन 3 stages. The stage of mild repression, the stage of conciliation, and the stage of isolation and suppression. ठीक है. तो स्टेज ऑफ माइल्ड रिप्रेशन में सरकार किसको रिप्रेस करेगी? एक्सट्रीमिस्ट को या मॉडरेट्स को? एक्सट्रीमिस्ट को. क्यों? क्योंकि माइल्ड रिप्रेशन से एक्सट्रीमिस्ट के ऊपर कोई ज्यादा फर्क नहीं पड़ेगा, बट मॉडरेट्स आर गोइंग टू फील अ ग्रेट डिग्री ऑफ डेंजर. दे आर गोइंग टू फील थ्रेटेंड. ये ऐसा ही होता है कि एक क्लासरूम में 2 तरह के बच्चे होंगे. कुछ बच्चे होते हैं बहुत सीधे साधे, टीचर्स पेट, और कुछ होते हैं ढेट टाइप के, राइट, लातों के भूत, राइट. तो टीचर को चाहिए क्या? द सपोर्ट एंड द ओबीडियंस ऑफ द वेल बिहेव्ड चिल्ड्रन. तो दे आर गोइंग टू टारगेट और मेक एन एग्जाम्पल ऑफ द बदमाश स्टूडेंट्स. तो उसको तो कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ेगा, उसका तो रोज का यही है, राइट. बट जो ये वाले स्टूडेंट्स हैं ये सहम जाएंगे. तो माइल्डली रिप्रेसिंग द एक्सट्रीमिस्ट लीडरशिप, फॉर एग्जाम्पल the deportation of Lala Lajpat Rai, the arrest of Ajit Singh, the incarceration of some other leaders, the dissolution, the forcible legal dissolution of some Swadeshi enterprises such as the Swadeshi steam company, etc. तो इनको गवर्नमेंट्स ने बंद करवा दिया जानबूझ करके. मॉडरेट्स को लगा कि अब हमारे पास और कोई रास्ता नहीं है. इफ वी कंटिन्यू टू सपोर्ट द एक्सट्रीमिस्ट, सेम थिंग इज गोइंग टू हैपन टू अस आल्सो सूनर और later, and it is going to have to affect us even more than it is affecting the extremists. Then conciliation, कि अब मॉडरेट्स को एक रास्ता दिखाने की जरूरत है. ठीक, that you have a way out. So it would mean the consultation and the series of meetings between the moderate leadership and the government in order to propose a series of constitutional reforms if the moderates were to leave the Swadeshi movement behind. तो उनको इंड्यूस किया जा रहा है, ठीक है. And thirdly, isolation and suppression. Once the moderates have distanced themselves from the extremists, there is nobody to legally defend the extremists, to politically defend the extremists, to defend the extremists through newspapers, to create favorable public opinion for them. And once the extremists have lost their shield, lost their umbrella of protection, then we can move in and openly suppress the extremists without any repercussions. ठीक है. तो इस स्टेज में ब्रूटल सप्रेशन होगा, मास अरेस्ट होंगे, डिपोर्टेशंस होंगे, ट्रायल्स होंगे, लॉन्ग इम्प्रिजनमेंट्स आर गोइंग टू बी गिवन आउट फॉर अ लार्ज वैरायटी ऑफ चार्जेस. ठीक है. तो दिस इज द स्ट्रैटेजी दैट द गवर्नमेंट अडॉप्टेड ड्यूरिंग दिस सूरत स्प्लिट. क्लियर हुआ है इतना? तो ये हैं रीजंस फॉर द फेलियर ऑफ द स्वदेशी मूवमेंट. एक चीज बची हुई है, दी significance of the Swadeshi movement. This we are going to do in tomorrow's class. ठीक है. चलिए then. Online students, if there are no doubts, shall I end this lecture?